To understand anything in history, you need context. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Anglo-Burmese wars, most people are not familiar with the context of British India or Compound Burma, often jumping straight into popular stereotypes. Furthermore, the conflict is greatly understudied, despite being one of the largest wars fought in the region. And honestly, the more I looked into it, the more I realized the YouTube series is barely gonna scratch even a fraction of it. The more I read, the more I feel like my scripts are inadequate to explain things that I want to. I could simplify the narrative, but that would not do it any justice. In fact, one of the biggest problems is that there's just way too many simplified versions of this war. So instead, I'm going to be focusing on different aspects of this war that could be viewed as a standalone or as part of a larger series. So to start off with that, I will begin with a bit of context of the Anglo-Burmese War. The causes of the 1824 war are directly tied with the rise and expansion of both British India and Compound Burma, both which rose to prominence in the 1750s. Ironically, both entities had first interacted as allies during the fall of the Taungoo dynasty, fighting against the Hantawadi kingdom, who were supported by the French as an indirect extension of the 7 Years' War. Although some 200 independent British mercenaries fought openly under the Compound commanders, official British troops and the company itself did little in the war, as their forces were too invested in India. The Compound's first king, Olympia, sought to make his alliance with Britain official in order to counter the French influence. While individual British officers supported this effort, the company itself and the British government had little interest in Burma and were far too invested in India and Europe to respond. Without official support, British influence in the Compound court soon lost favor to their rivals like the French, Portuguese, and Armenians. It is difficult to point out exactly what the relationship was. Some British and Burmese authors argue that it remained negative all the way to the outbreak of the conflict. Others, however, maintain that the relations were largely friendly and hostilities were only the result of miscommunication and mutual ignorance. What is clear, though, is that the dynamics had changed in the 1800s. Both the EIC and the Compound dynasty had expanded greatly in the decades, beginning with the acquisition of Bengal following the Battle of Pelsi in 1759. The company, with the support of the British government, had defeated the powerful Mysore Kingdom and the Maratha Confederacy. By 1819, it had become the dominant power on the Indian subcontinent. Meanwhile, the Compound had established itself as a major force in Southeast Asia by defeating the Qing invasions. But now the new kings had become desperate to repeat and live up to the glorious reigns of Olympia and Simbushin, because anything less would challenge rival princes to take the throne, and thus these kings became more aggressive in their military pursuits that could either reform the old Taungoo Empire or at the very least replicate the same influence it had. After their efforts against the increasingly powerful Ratanakosi kingdom became stumped, the Compound kings turned westward. By 1819, they had succeeded in taking Mra'u, Imphal, and the Ahom kingdoms either directly or under their influence. The simultaneous expansion of the two empires inevitably led to the formation of a long and unstable border together. The biggest problem, however, were the cultural and political differences between these two empires. A series of border tensions between the two powers finally drew flashpoints. First of all, both powers understood space and borders differently. The British followed the Westphalian model where territories were marked and drawn out, often marked by certain geographical features such as the Naf River that is still being used between modern Myanmar and Bangladesh. This type of border makes a lot of sense for present modern viewers who are used to a world structured in fixed boundaries. However, this is not how the Southeast Asian world of the 1800s saw boundaries. Even before clashing with Compound Burma, British colonial officials found local inhabitants constantly crossing borders, living and moving on either side. This is because Southeast Asian polities frequently define their boundaries via populations based around a center rather than physical markings. This meant that both British and Burmese borders were already entangled since the formation of British Bengal and Koman Arakan. This already complicated issue was escalated when armed groups seeking to restore the Rakhine Marau Kingdom began to stage border raids into Koman Burma and then retreat into British territory, which inevitably led to clashes between pursuing Koman troops and British border forces. The issue was not unnoticed by British and Burmese leaders, and throughout the 20 years leading up to the conflict, officials from Calcutta and Ava attempted to negotiate this. But their very differing views on sovereignty and culture made it difficult to align their interests except through temporary truce and withdrawals. Their efforts were also hindered by the conduct of British envoys to Burma, lords who received them, with both sides openly being arrogant and disrespectful. Since the envoys described themselves as servants of the East India Company, many Burmese saw the British officials in India, at best, the King of Britain's representatives, or at worst, unruly commoners that overextend their place, like that of petty officials. On the other hand, the British frequently described the Burmese, Thai, and other Southeast Asians as semi-barbarous nations that were just above tribal people, but still savages at heart. Furthermore, both sides had clashing imperial ambitions. This was brought to the forefront in the Indian Northeast, where both the British and the Burmese began supporting opposing leaders in the conflicts of Assam, Manipur, and Kachar. Historically, both Burmese and English language authors blamed the other for the aggression, but modern historians agree that both sides were equally active and had ambitious agendas in the Northeast. The British saw the Burmese invading border states that they were using for buffer zones or for future territories of expansion, and therefore threatening their newly established empire. The Burmese, on the other hand, saw Assam and Manipur as part of the Kombaan dynasty through the leaders who had sworn loyalty to the Golden Throne, and saw the British as interfering in internal matters and actively encouraging internal uprisings against the Burmese crown. There is actually a lot of evidence as to why both sides concluded these views. The British had witnessed the Kombaan dynasty consistently waging wars and saw its influence expanding from the 1770s to the 1820s, and therefore saw this conflict as part of another imperial expansion. In particular, the common Southeast Asian tactic of using scorched-earth policies led to a large amount of refugees fleeing into British territory, from which many would use the British border troops as shields and then launch counterattacks. Furthermore, Calcutta, the capital of British India, was geographically closer to the Burmese kingdom than their other enemies. They had also just recently defeated the powerful Marathas, and many resentful Indian princely states were just waiting for the company to show any sign of weakness, which was also contributed by Burmese diplomatic contact with some of these rajas. For the Burmese, their agents and diplomats in India had witnessed and reported how the British East India Company had defeated Bengal, Mysore, and Marathas, largely by playing rival rulers against each other to nullify their advantage in numbers, and then force them into fighting battles that played to the superior British firepower. According to a Burmese agent's report in the Royal Orders of Burma, British warfare in India was described to be treacherous and destructive, with particular reference to their wars against Mysore and the Marathas. This view was likely reinforced by how anti-Kombaan resistance from the defeated Rakhine, Manipur and Ahom factions would strike back from British areas, together with the company leaders' refusal to apprehend or cooperate with Kombaan forces from trying to stop them. This meant that both sides had long seen each other with distrust. Still, officers on both sides managed to keep hostilities away, but the recent military achievements by both the EIC and the Kombaan Court make their leadership proud and overconfident of their capabilities. Thus, when the British and Burmese troops first violently clashed in Kachar, the banners of war just needed to be unfurled. The final straw came with the dispute of the Shalpuri Island. The British considered the island as part of British Bengal from the Bengal Suba of the Mughal Empire, while the Burmese considered the island Similpuchun, as known in Burmese, and its settlements to be subjects of the Komban Arakan's Danyawadi state as the successor of the Mra'u kingdom. The issue was complicated as locals on all sides used the island freely. When British sepoys raised the Union Jack on the island and were in response attacked and driven out by Danyawadi soldiers, Governor-General Lord William Amherst declared war on the Komban dynasty.